All right. Here it is.
Now, just snip those cables and off we
One
go.
of the core subplots of the storyline is regarding the Combine imprisonment and use of the Vortigaunts to trap the G-Man. The multi-dimensional power of the Vortigaunts to detain the seemingly invincible G-Man is established in previous Half-Life lore. Through the use of their prisoner pods and substation technology, the Combine extract the power of the Vortigaunts' Vortessence chant, tune that energy, and then transmit it to the vault to contain the G-Man. To communicate this Combine process to the player without explaining it through lengthy exposition, we used musical sound patterns to represent the process implicitly. If you stand near the pods holding the Vortigaunts, you can hear them groaning their chant in a slow but semi-musical pattern. Just past the pods is the resonator, within which you can hear a distilled version of the chant energy. Finally, the cables are activated with the concentrated Vortigaunt energy, which is harmonized in varying patterns and intermittently transmitted to the vault once the energy is sufficiently tuned. If you stand near the cables while they're tuning, you'll notice the sheer size and height of the sound. This was achieved by placing the sound emitters for each cable at the locations of the actual cables themselves. The sound of the cables covers a broad frequency range, which emphasizes Steam Audio's head-related transfer function processing. That simulation, combined with the feedback of the observer's inner ear as she looks upwards, gives the same impression of scale that VR is known to give visual objects.
Character performance within a VR game has a unique set of opportunities and challenges. In our efforts to keep control in the hands of the player, we must create a performance that is interesting enough to maintain players' attention, and flexible enough to allow for player freedom. This scene has the most face-to-face interaction in the game, and there is no physical barrier between the player and the Vortigaunt when he first appears. At one point, we played with the idea of a jump scare when the Vortigaunt is released, upending the player's expectations of what had been referred to only as a battery up until that point. Not only was it a bit ham-fisted, but the Vortigaunt came flailing out of the pod, frequently into the same space occupied by the player. To solve this problem, we cut the jump scare and slid the pod back out of the player's space as it opened, to allow for the Vortigaunt to emerge at a comfortable distance. We faced a similar challenge when determining how to get both the player and Vortigaunt to their next locations without intersecting. We wanted to get the player and Vortigaunt side by side overlooking the vista, while the Vortigaunt delivered critical exposition. It would have been awkward for the player and Vortigaunt to take the same route along the catwalk, so we looked at other options, including exploring ways that the Vortigaunt may have once moved in its native environment. With long forearms, it's feasible that the Vortigaunts may have moved around as quadrupeds, so we chose an agile four-legged scramble up to the higher platform where he can deliver exposition without contending with the player for space.
There. We are ripped from ourselves.
We have to stop them from killing your friends.
The Vortigaunt will extract ourselves and exact our own vengeance. You must go to the weapon.
Well, I can't get into the vault if the substations are still online.
Do not worry, Alyx fans. They will not be. We will not allow it. I will clear the path. Our paths diverge. But remember, there is no distance between us. We are coterminous.
Thanks. Good luck.
Putting a lot of trust in that Vortigaunt to shut down all the substations.
I trust him.
Yes, me too. Because if he doesn't, well, that vault isn't going anywhere, and we'll be standing there with no vault to break into, surrounded by Combine.
Russ, trusting him is our only plan here. He'll do this. We can do this.
Yes, you're right. He'll be fine. We're all going to be fine.
While developing Half-Life Alyx, we had a large number of people in many disciplines contributing to a relatively small number of maps. This meant that we frequently had multiple people working on the same map at the same time. One way that we managed this complexity was to break our maps into smaller pieces referred to as prefabs. A prefab could be built out of the same types of geometry, logic, enemies, particle systems, or any other elements as a regular map. As long as people were working in separate prefabs, they could make changes or additions without stepping on each other's work. A prefab could contain a large physical space like this whole street scene, or it could contain only a handful of elements. Large prefabs that partitioned a map to allow for collaboration were essential for a project of this scope. But many small, reusable prefabs were created for Half-Life Alyx as well. A good example of this was the set of reusable vehicle prefabs used here and throughout the game. Each vehicle was authored as a configurable prefab, enabling designers to quickly place them around the game, setting a few parameters to customize the vehicle for the context. Parameters include things like the vehicle's paint color, the amount of pre-existing damage, whether the doors were open or simply missing, and the type of ammunition or other resources the vehicle might contain. This sped up our workflow and also meant that updates to a prefab were automatically propagated out to all of the maps that used it.
What do you think, Russ? Guess we better cooperate.
Yeah, sounds like she means business.
We had a good run.
Cooperate.
The tarps used by the Combine to cover buildings in the quarantine zone are animated procedurally. This animation was added relatively late in development, so it needed to be both computationally inexpensive and technologically conservative, so no new systems. Simple overlapping waveforms are used to displace the tarp geometry where it hangs loosely away from the building. The displacements are oriented along the wind direction, and their propagation direction is further modified by the gradients of a texture we refer to as a freedom of motion map. This map is derived from the shape of the building geometry under the tarp, and is used to attenuate the displacement so that the tarp won't animate in places where it is meant to be pulled tight against the building. The result is a flapping tarp that seems to conform to its surroundings and responds appropriately to the wind.
The Combine soldier you see here won't fight you. It's been programmed to run back and forth along the path shown on the ground in order to illustrate the stride retargeting system developed for Half-Life Alyx. One of the challenges of animating digital characters is making sure that their feet don't slide along the ground as they move. Humans are very good at picking out irregularities in the movements of virtual characters, especially in VR, and Combine soldiers in particular need to look like their feet are planting and their weight is shifting as they change direction. Otherwise, they appear weightless and unconvincing. In a pre-processing phase, our stride retargeting system analyzes the steps of each authored animation and stores them as a direction-independent trajectory. At runtime, our system predicts where each foot will land on the next step based on the motion of the animation, the character's path, and the height of the ground. The pairs of colored boxes on the ground illustrate this process. The red boxes show the previous foot positions, The green boxes indicate the soldier's current foot position, and the blue boxes are drawn where each foot is predicted to land next. Once the predicted foot positions are calculated, the system guides the feet to the predicted locations using the trajectory information to preserve the style of the original animation. Once the foot lands, it is locked in place until the next step. In the end, this system was so effective that we could essentially make any animation walk in any direction without foot sliding. You can experiment with the system by moving around the area, since the soldier has been set up to always face you while running the specified path.
Getting kind of crowded down here.
Comcamera's gone crazy since we took out that substation. They know we're after the vault now. Whatever's in there, they really, really don't want us to have it.
Well, now I just feel more.
Now that's the spirit.
Trip mines have appeared in prior Half-Life games, and the act of defusing them seemed like a natural fit for a VR game, where players can perform complex operations with their hands. By this point in the game, players have already learned how to hack Combine technology with their multi-tool, but we wanted defusing a trip mine to be more tense than the hacking puzzles. To defuse a trip mine, not only does the player have to place their hand near the laser that could trigger the mine, but they have to perform the task within just a few seconds. Early versions of this puzzle were inspired by lockpicking, resembling a series of tumblers that the player had to quickly align. Unfortunately, the tumbler design required players to rotate their wrists in an uncomfortable manner, particularly given that they had to also avoid touching the laser beam. We removed the rotational component, but kept the timing element, leading to the mechanic you see in the final game. We also experimented with causing the trip mines to actually explode if the player failed to defuse them, but most players found this too punishing, especially in cases where a chain reaction of explosions could occur. Instead, the mines just stay active and the player can attempt to defuse them again. We did end up keeping this behavior for the hard difficulty setting, but added a warning sound a few seconds before the mine actually explodes, to give players some time to move away. We also experimented with allowing defused mines to be removed and redeployed by the player, but we hadn't designed enough combat scenarios around this mechanic for it to be satisfying in practice, so this was left out of the final game.
This combat arena that loops back over itself as the player winds through the tenement buildings was one of the earliest test maps built when we began adding Combine soldiers to Half-Life Alyx. One of the lessons we learned from this series of combat encounters was that fighting Combine soldiers was physically taxing on players, as we needed to pay careful attention to pacing. Taking cover, reloading, switching weapons, and acquiring targets really pushed on all the skills that players had learned up until this point. To help cut down on fatigue, we added gaps between the Combine encounters and removed some of the combat altogether to better pace the experience. The trip mines in the stairwell following this battle are a good example of one of the pacing elements we used to slow the player down and let them recuperate before the combat ramps back up again.
Russ, are they saying my name?
Yeah, that's not good.
Last 4 shells.
It was an interesting challenge for artists and level designers to employ environmental storytelling to paint a picture of what may have happened inside the walls of the quarantine zone. Just like the hotel, these apartments have been overrun by Zen foliage and are filled with people's belongings, abandoned in haste. In this area, the walls have been torn down, either by destructive portal storms or perhaps the Combine's cleanup effort. Barrels of fluid used by workers to try and treat or contain the Zen growth have been left behind, and it would appear that the cleanup efforts have either failed or been abandoned. By not explaining every facet of the world, we leave players with the opportunity to imagine for themselves the bigger picture of life in City 17.
Bring more.
Alyx? Alyx? Oh, your dad's back.
Oh, thank God.
Russell! God damn, it's good to see you!
Likewise. Oh, this is great. Honestly, I'd pegged your survival at about 4%.
You can thank that Vortigern. He got me back here in one piece.
Russ? Russell, put Dad on.
Alyx, baby!
Dad! We just took down a substation.
Good. Because when they move this thing, that weapon's gone. We need to get it tonight.
We will. You still got that data pod, right?
I do. Russ, this thing's biocoded. I'm gonna need the TLI.
Yep, it's right over there.
Okay, great. You good, honey?
For sure. You go ahead. I'll be fine, Dad. I promise.
Keep that promise. I'll get to work on the data pod.
Once we had the spine of the game complete, teams went through the maps looking for additional opportunities to add the character and tone that players associate with the Half-Life games. This mannequin head grab was a fun opportunity to hit on the sci-fi horror B-movie vibe. We had a few conversations about how long to leave the head crab atop the mannequin, and decided that the experience should be analogous to catching a small dog in the middle of some mischief. We wanted players to feel like they had walked in on something they weren't supposed to see, and for them to go away feeling like every inch of the game contained something for them to find if they chose to explore it. After an early update to the headcrab sounds, where details like breathing and grunting were added for the first time, we received feedback that the new sounds were too cute and familiar, moving the headcrab too far in the direction of a cuddly creature rather than an alien threat. We updated the sounds to be more threatening, but for this headcrab we brought back some of the cuter sounds to sell the headcrab's frustration with the mannequin.
In order to reduce the amount of reloading required in the heat of battle, we wanted players to be able to upgrade the pistol by increasing its ammo capacity. That might seem like a small change, but implementing it in a way that was intuitive to players and that didn't have a lot of negative side effects was surprisingly tricky to get right. Our initial mechanic for increasing the ammo capacity was to use double-sized clips. Once the pistol was upgraded, the player's backpack held clips with twice as many bullets, and those were represented by a clip model that was twice as long. But unfortunately, the longer clips presented a lot of distracting fictional problems. For one, they looked ridiculous protruding out of the bottom of the pistol. Players were also left wondering what was going on in their backpack to transform the single capacity clips that they put in there into the double capacity versions that they were pulling out. We were also left with the sort of absurd implication that the pistol clips found in the world now magically all had to be the upgraded double-sized versions. While we did scrap the double-sized clips, the concept was still enticing. We just needed to find a better metaphor. So then we started looking at the hoppers that were used on paintball guns that could store large amounts of paintballs. In fact, the final upgrade that resulted from this whole line of thinking is still internally referred to as the bullet hopper. So with this in mind, we next needed to design an intuitive interaction model. Players were already satisfied with our existing pistol interaction loop, which was eject clip, insert the next one, chamber, and then shoot. So we wanted to preserve these skills that players were already beginning to master. So players would still reload the gun as before, but small mechanical prongs would steal bullets from the inserted clip, pull them into the hopper, and then place them into the firing chamber as needed. Audio cues were also added to clearly communicate the state of the hopper loading process. The hopper also impacted the visual design that we used to convey the state of the pistol. Originally, the clips themselves had a numerical counter indicating the number of bullets remaining. And on its own, this was fine, and players understood it easily. But the readout on the bullet hopper was on the opposite side of the pistol, and had a pattern of blue dots indicating the amount of bullets remaining. So these two representations in two different locations made it difficult for players to quickly determine the total number of bullets in the upgraded gun. To solve this, we designed a single visual readout on the side of the pistol grip. It structurally matched the state of a pistol clip, the pistol's bullet chamber, and the bullet hopper, if the upgrade was acquired.
I'd never survive a jump from this height.
No, absolutely not. Why, were you considering it?
Russ, how's Dad doing? Does he seem okay?
Oh, he's fine, Alyx. He's working away over there.
Good. Well, thanks.
Oh, he is missing a leg, though.
Yeah. You know, he was missing a leg before.
Right. Well, it's still gone.
Thanks, Russ.
Sure thing.
seeing that?
The Vortigons are taking down the substation.
Yes!
This might work.
Deploy technician teams to blocks 496477. Maintain priority.
It's generally a requirement that all new enemy types have a section of the game designed to introduce them. We rarely build the introduction early on in the process, though, because it's often through playtesting that we learn exactly what aspects of the new enemy need to be highlighted in the introduction. In addition to understanding the capabilities of a new enemy, we also find introductions help solidify the very existence of the new enemy type in the player's mind. Without an explicit introduction, we sometimes find that playtesters confuse multiple enemy types, conflating them in their minds. This was the case with the Suppressor, the class of soldier that's designed to pin a player behind cover while other soldiers advance on them. The Suppressor is an inversion of the previous soldier classes, who've all focused on trying to push players out of cover. The Suppressor introduction stretches across the next two rooms. In the first, players see the Suppressor firing at zombies, giving the player a moment to safely observe its firing behavior. They also get to hear its associated sounds, which are important to learn for future encounters. In the second room, players learn to fight the Suppressor themselves. This is relatively straightforward when the Suppressor is alone, but will become more involved in later arenas where we combine the Suppressor with other soldier types.
Okay.
Okay, there's no direct path from where you are to the vault, so you're going to have to
It isn't
snake your way
practical
there.
to spend development time or art resources evenly across every part of the game, so we rely on strategic reuse of resources to maintain fidelity and specificity across the game's environments. This space was initially constructed using industrial models and textures seen throughout many previous environments. To set it apart, we added the large cables and Vortigaunt pods to imply a makeshift combine power plant whose purpose was to transmit energy to the substations. The juxtaposition of this abandoned industrial space with the large combine cables created enough visual interest to make the space feel meaningful at a relatively low cost. The cable motif was subsequently added to other parts of the game to increase visual interest and give the player a sense of being led toward the vault. It may not be obvious, but the cables exiting through the ceiling here continue on to the exterior of the building, across the large construction courtyard, and over the roof of the distillery building, presumably continuing on to a substation or other combine infrastructure. Players may not notice that continuation, but such details help guide us in building a world that feels connected and consistent. It isn't practical to spend development
One problem we faced with the VR movement styles that Alyx supported was keeping the combat experience from diverging based upon whether players were using teleport or continuous movement. If the combat was significantly different depending on the player's movement setting, our playtesting requirements could explode combinatorially. One way that we prevented this combinatorial explosion was by ensuring that AIs could sense player movement, no matter which locomotion style the player was using. To do this, we created a visual proxy for players using teleport locomotion. Imagine a scenario where the player is behind cover, hidden from a soldier's sight. If the player used continuous movement to run to another piece of nearby cover, the soldier would see them while they were out in the open. But a player who instantly teleported from one piece of cover to the next would not be seen. To solve this discrepancy, when a player teleports, we leave a breadcrumb trail of invisible visual proxies, which the enemy AI can see. These proxies pass information to the AI, similar to what it would have gathered from seeing the player perform the movement directly. In this case, the soldier would know the teleporting player had left the original cover and run across open ground to the new cover, just like a player using continuous motion. While obviously not identical, in that the soldier didn't have a chance to take a shot at the teleporting player, these kinds of features did allow us to reduce the number of ways our AI logic needed to take player movement options into consideration.
For Half-Life Alyx, we wanted to expand the functionality of our soundscape system, which is used to play ambient sounds. In prior games, we could generally only play one soundscape at a time. The player would be hearing either soundscape A or soundscape B, with a brief crossfade from one to the other. In this game, the soundscapes are much more flexible and can be overlapped in ways that enable more realistic transitions. For example, the volume of different soundscapes can be controlled by the player's position and the open or closed state of particular doors in the world. We frequently use this functionality in areas like this transition between indoor and outdoor spaces. If you pause outside for a moment, you'll notice the crickets, birds, distant dog barks, and other environmental sounds that help paint the picture of the quarantine zone late in the day. As you move into the indoor area, you'll notice the outdoor soundscape diminish as you move away from the door. In fact, if you close the door, the volume of the outdoor soundscape is reduced even further. And as you progress into the building, you'll begin to notice the indoor soundscape, consisting of the indistinct hum of machinery and buzz of electrical fixtures.
Whew. Okay.
We can take a shortcut through that building.
Okay. Don't see a way into this building, so I'm gonna look around. What is this place, anyway?
It's a distillery. They made vodka and things like that.
Is vodka good?
Oh, God, no.
Russell doesn't like vodka. Got it.
Well, I never said that.
But it's not good?
It's poison.
But
I love it. Everyone loves it.
okay, that's all very confusing. Let me figure out how to get in, and then I'll find you some.
Wonderful if you could, actually, yes. aren't running again. Ignore that. We'll meet you outside. It looks as if there are Combine barricades up ahead. They're stopping anyone from getting any closer to the vault.
Okay, so what do you think?
Make your way into the distillery and see where it takes you. With my drone back online, we've finally got the... Oh, no, you're kidding me!
For our teleport and continuous locomotion modes, we provide corresponding ladder climbing methods. By default, player using teleport locomotion can target a ladder and after a short timer, get teleported to the top or the bottom, depending on where they started. The timer was necessary to ensure that players were intentionally using the ladder. We didn't want them to unintentionally target the ladder and become disoriented when they found themselves at the other end. Players using continuous locomotion can directly grab ladders to climb up or down. In this mode, they can grab a ladder rung and move their hand down to raise their body, or move their hand up to lower it. This allows players to move up or down the ladder rung by rung in a natural way. This mode turned out to be so... For our teleport and continuous locomotion modes, we provide corresponding ladder climbing methods. By default, player using teleport locomotion can target a ladder and after a short timer, get teleported to the top or the bottom, depending on where they started. The timer was necessary to ensure that players were intentionally using the ladder. We didn't want them to unintentionally target the ladder and become disoriented when they found themselves at the other end. Players using continuous locomotion can directly grab ladders to climb up or down. In this mode, they can grab a ladder rung and move their hand down to raise their body, or move their hand up to lower it. This allows players to move up or down the ladder rung by rung in a natural way. This mode turned out to be so popular that we added it as an option even for players using teleport locomotion. As it happens, most of the ladders in our game do not extend very far beyond the upper landing area. This made dismounting the top of a ladder challenging for players using continuous ladder climbing, since there's very little ladder to grab onto above the landing area. To solve this, we detect when the player stops holding the ladder with both hands and automatically teleport them to either the top or the bottom, based on the direction they were climbing. Unfortunately, we don't have a lot of explicit ladder training in the game, so some players are surprised by this teleport behavior if they accidentally let go with both hands while climbing. Nevertheless, this was a better alternative to leaving the players hanging or forcing them to fall down if they let go with both hands, especially since some of our ladders are rather long and it would be tedious to have to reclimb just because a player happened to let go shortly before reaching the top.
Most of the time, the noises that attract Jeff are created by the player, who is either actively trying to lure him to a new location, or has perhaps made a noisy mistake that could have been avoided. The key point being that the player feels some amount of responsibility for the noises being made. The goal of the upcoming hallway was to flip that idea on its head, if only for a moment. Like a misbehaving pet, this cheeky headcrab appears to surprise and infuriate the player, clumsily knocking over a series of bottles before escaping into a vent. Classic headcrab nonsense. We were surprised to find that many players wanted to check and see if the headcrab had indeed escaped. They would climb up onto the boxes and crane their head up into the vents. This prompted the idea of adding a small Easter egg to reward those players. Try it, and you'll find that the cheeky crab has indeed escaped to be annoying another day. The cost of adding these sorts of secrets needs to be weighed against the potential for players to actually discover them. In this case, our playtest observations made the cost appear worth it, in particular for the impact it would have in making the world feel more real. A full reality where living creatures go about their lives, even if the player isn't there to witness them.
Alex, coming in. Hey, Alex. Oh, there you are. Can you hear me?
More or less. You're breaking up.
I think you're still in the distillery.
I made a friend named Jeff.
Well, that's great. We can take all the help we can get.
Yeah, we're not really close.
Listen, there should be a big tunnel-sized plug in the floor there somewhere. That's gonna be...
The tunnel out of here?
Correct. You get it open, I'll figure out where it leads.
Since the entire premise of Jeff hinged on keeping Jeff and the player in close proximity to each other, the distillery map was constructed as a series of chambers connected by one-way transitions. Early on, we used two techniques in concert to keep Jeff and the player together throughout the level. First, each new area was gated with a special locked door. These took the form of impenetrable Zen membranes that only Jeff could tear through. The player would lure Jeff to the membrane using sound, and Jeff would break it open so that both Jeff and the player could proceed. We had always had a goal of having players describe Jeff in adversarial terms, as a constant pursuer or a thorn in their side. The problem with the Zen membrane concept was that it led to players describing Jeff as a useful tool, or worse, an angry co-op partner, rather than something they feared. Another way that we would keep Jeff and the player together was via the use of one-way drops. Jeff would fall off catwalks, platforms, and ladders into each new area. These drops functioned as intended, but just like the Zen membranes, elicited an undesirable reaction from players, especially when repeated multiple times. Watching Jeff do these pratfalls left players feeling like he was less dangerous. They felt sorry for him, and even laughed at him. Eventually, we realized that we could use combined force fields, which the player cannot pass through, as a way to create one-way doors. These force fields allowed Jeff to move through them, but required the player to follow via another one-way path. This allowed us to build thresholds where Jeff and the player could both move forward while eliminating the awkwardness of the Zen membranes, and avoiding the repeated falls that had previously made Jeff look so clumsy. Combined force fields also had a few other benefits. For one, they gave Jeff a convenient way to take a backstage route that is inaccessible to the player, like the one at the bottom of this ladder. They also tied in nicely with Jeff's fictional background as a former member of the Combine Zen cleanup crew.
Creating an experience with such a heavy focus on audio presented some unique design problems. The primary challenge was determining which sounds Jeff should be able to hear and making sure that players understood the rules. Half-Life Alyx contains a vast array of physics objects. However, through playtesting we found it best to use only a small set of them in the distillery. We needed to pay close attention to each object that we did include, particularly to audio design for collisions between the object and the various surface types used in the distillery. It was important that what players heard matched their expectations for how Jeff would react. In early testing, we would find individual cases where players would say things like, "I don't know why Jeff got angry," or "I would have expected that noise to attract Jeff." Over time, we identified these cases of confusion and addressed them one by one. It was vital that players always be able to identify the cause and effect of a noise that might attract Jeff. Failing this meant players were left feeling like Jeff acted randomly and they'd grow frustrated. Some experiments failed in this area. At one point, parts of the level were littered with piles of broken glass that would make noise if the player walked or teleported over them. Few players would notice the broken glass and were then surprised when Jeff attacked, so this concept was cut to avoid confusion. We had to be wary of the opposite case too, where players would expect purely aesthetic elements to present a noise hazard. For example, at one point we had placed shallow pools of water seeping in among the floor tiles. It looked really cool, but it confused some of our playtesters who thought that the sound of their footsteps splashing through these puddles would be audible to Jeff, even though we never intended that to be the case.
Nicely done. And there we go.
Security alert. Reminder, ground team. Mission failure will result in permanent relocation. Response code, breach. Maneuver, inoculate.
Figuring out how to end the player's journey through the distillery involved a lot of discussion about how players would ultimately end up feeling about Jeff. Observing playtests told us that most players simply wanted him dead, usually from the moment they met him, but there were some who felt kind of sorry for him and didn't necessarily want to see him killed. Our first version of the ending involved the player's actions unintentionally resulting in Jeff being attacked and dragged away by antlions. Part of the goal was to demonstrate that the antlions are even more powerful than Jeff, to amp up the tension just before players have to square off against antlions themselves. This ending left players feeling a little empty. They felt detached from Jeff's demise and wanted to be more directly involved. Dark stuff, to be sure. Plus, we weren't really servicing those players who felt sorry for Jeff and didn't necessarily want to see him killed. There were other problems too. The antlion attack felt random to many players, which reduced its impact. And because Jeff presumably died off-screen, players were left without a sense of closure. This prevented players from being able to switch gears and settle in for their encounter with the antlions. The trash compactor was a solution to these problems. It gave players the opportunity to decide Jeff's fate and be left with a sense of closure whether they decided to squash him or just leave him imprisoned. Even so, it has to be admitted that most players seemed to crush Jeff with zero hesitation.
That tunnel heads to the vault.
Great. Also, little heads up. I think the tunnel is full of antlions. Just in case I cut out permanently.
Antlions.
Yeah, you know, aliens with stabby legs.
Oh, yes, and very small, like ants.
No.
Like tiny little lions.
No, that's not them. These ones are pretty dangerous.
Right, well, whatever they are, they're down that tunnel.
Yep. Off I go. You know, Russ, I'm sorry I didn't get you any vodka back there.
That's okay. Well, you could pick up some on the way back. be on the wrong side of that.
That's an antlion, Russell.
That's an antlion?
Yes. So you do know what antlions are.
Yes, they're leggies.
In some of our early experiments bringing Half-Life 2 enemies to VR, we found that antlions in particular showed promise and were interesting to fight, but tended to quickly overwhelm playtesters. They were able to get into the player's physical space too quickly, and applied so much pressure that players just ended up endlessly teleporting around trying to get away. Around the same time, we were discovering that all players, even relative novices, have surprisingly good aim in VR. The variability of aiming ability amongst players is simply much lower in VR than it is in mouse and keyboard games. To take advantage of the idea that players would consistently be able to make precise shots, we started testing an antlion design which players could slow down by shooting off the legs. Playtesters reacted positively to both the need for accuracy and the organic feeling that this gave the antlions when their legs flew off and the injured antlion continued to limp toward them. The removal of the legs was clear to players, but presenting the fact that the abdomen was invulnerable until the legs were removed was a long-standing challenge. There was no single solution to communicating this effectively to playtesters, but rather a series of small additions that communicated the behavior. For example, we made the abdomen dull and black one invulnerable, and changed it to match the bright orange legs as it became vulnerable. Shooting armored parts of the antlion would generate sparks and hard ricochet sounds, while shooting the vulnerable body parts resulted in orange blood spurts and soft impact sounds. We also designed the death animations to emphasize the abdomen exploding, and ensured that an exploded abdomen chunk was left behind after the antlion was dead. In some of our early experiments bringing Half-Life 2 enemies to VR, we found that antlions in particular showed promise and were interesting to fight, but tended to quickly overwhelm playtesters. They were able to get into the player's physical space too quickly, and applied so much pressure that players just ended up endlessly teleporting around trying to get away. Around the same time, we were discovering that all players, even relative novices, have surprisingly good aim in VR. The variability of aiming ability amongst players is simply much lower in VR than it is in mouse and keyboard games. To take advantage of the idea that players would consistently be able to make precise shots, we started testing an antlion design which players could slow down by shooting off the legs. Playtesters reacted positively to both the
All of the foliage in the game animates in response to player touch and environmental wind conditions. The foliage animation is entirely procedural and is computed on the graphics processor using vertex shader deformation. A voxel field that travels with the player's body is used to track the location of the player's hands in space. The hands effectively draw motion trails into this voxel field, which can be sampled by the foliage's vertex shader and used to drive deformations, allowing the player to bat the foliage around with their hands. The foliage also interacts with wind, allowing us to give ambient motion to the plants. In order to accommodate a range of environmental design, we tuned the wind deformations at different speeds, from slight drafts to hurricane force winds. It turned out, though, that the ambient wind was never required to be more than a moderate breeze, and for most of development, the hurricane effect was unused. This particular zoo habitat was added late in development and required a critical extension to the procedural foliage animation system. Prior to adding this habitat, the foliage didn't need to deform in response to enemy animation or grenade explosions, but of course, this area is all about throwing grenades at zombies. To address this, we added a low-resolution voxel field that could be sampled by the foliage shader to apply additional deformations. This low-resolution voxel field, which is about 1 cubic foot per voxel, is fixed in space and spans the entire habitat. For comparison, the voxel field that travels with the player is about 2 cubic inches per voxel. Enemies and grenades within this space can write motion trails and impacts into the low-resolution voxel field, which are ultimately interpreted by the foliage shader as wind forces. This is when preparation met opportunity. When grenades explode, they are creating localized hurricane force winds.
digress, do you think a head crab could turn a gorilla into a zombie?
Honestly, if there's a gorilla on the loose, I'm not sure a head crab's gonna make it much worse.
I got something.
What is it?
Yeah. What is it, Dad?
It doesn't look like they actually built the weapon. It's like they, I don't know, discovered something. Or maybe they uncovered it.
What do you mean?
If I'm reading this right, they tracked it to an old apartment building in the QZ, but instead of going in to get it, they grabbed the whole building and built a vault around it.
Holy crap. They must have been terrified of this thing.
I'm trying to figure out whether we ought to be.
Whoa, God!
There were very few existing antlion sounds to work with coming into Half-Life Alyx, so unlike most of the familiar Half-Life creatures, which often had legacy sounds layered in, nearly all of the sounds for the antlions were completely new material. Starting with an almost blank canvas, we drew inspiration from the behavior of the antlions to inform their sound design. Since the antlions attack in waves, it seemed reasonable to us that they communicated and organized into groups for attack. This idea led us to incorporate complex insect-like clicking sounds, the final version of which began as recordings of European starlings, which turned out to provide more variation in character than insect recordings. Here you can hear the original European starling sounds. We took those recordings and layered them with designed elements to create the antlion sounds used in the game.
3 left.
In traditional games, analog controls like levers, dials, and crank wheels usually play simple animations in response to a player's mouse click or key press. In VR, however, players with tracked hand controllers expect to be able to control analog interfaces by grabbing and moving them directly. To support this, we developed a new system that we call Anim Interactables. The opening mechanism of this health station is a good example of an Anim Interactable. To your left and right, you can see some more examples, such as a large railroad switch, the Vortigaunt's fire alarm doorbell, a crank wheel, a rolling cabinet door, and both the antenna and tuning dial on the radio. Anim Interactables like these allow us to give the player control of analog interfaces while constraining their input to an authored range of motion. The system uses the position and orientation of the player's hand to drive the animation of a model which defines the analog interface. As the player moves their tracked controller, the Anim Interactable continuously performs a search to determine if playing the animation forward or backward will place the interaction point closer to the tracked controller's position in space. This allows the player to drag the animation forward, backward, or hold it stationary. The result is an intuitive correspondence between the player's body and the virtual interface. Furthermore, these interactive animations don't necessarily have to make physical sense. Artists simply animate the range of motion they want the player to be able to control. These Anim Interactables have their debug visualizations turned on, so you can see the authored range of motion, including the nonlinear paths used on the railroad switch, the health station, and the crank wheel. Anim Interactables allowed us to make all kinds of objects in the world interactive, from mundane man-made devices to intricate combined mechanisms, without the need to run complex physical simulations. Feel free to play around with the Anim Interactables in this area before moving on.
Keep what in?
I don't know. I'm not sure if this data part even knows. But they got something trapped in there.
Whoa. Okay. So if it's not a weapon, are we still doing this?
The way I see it, whatever's in there doesn't like the Combine very much. So we got that in common.
True.
So, are we still doing this?
This far, I say we keep going. And if you find out it's something we really shouldn't mess with, we'll call it off.
That's my girl. I'll let you know what I find.
Sometimes large chunks of a level are shifted around or reordered as we work on the game. That's the case for this entire area and the toner puzzle it's centered around. In fact, for much of its existence, this area didn't even have a home anywhere in the game. It was originally built just to help prototype the toner puzzle mechanic. Over the course of a few months, the raw gameplay mechanics of toner puzzles were developed and playtested in a series of small test levels. Each test level explored a single gameplay concept. Those were things like using the toner puzzle to draw the player's eyes to something interesting, such as Zen flora and fauna, creating moments of surprise when an enemy head crab popped out of a vent, or requiring the player to thread their arm and hand in behind pipes or other tight spaces. Once we figured out which of these ideas were working well, we combined them into a single test level with the toner puzzle that strung all these concepts together in one single puzzle. Further playtesting in this level made us confident that toner puzzles should be included in the game, and we started adding them into other areas. But we didn't include the test level itself anywhere in the game. It wasn't until later that it became apparent that the zoo was in need of a pace break. We pay careful attention to player fatigue when we playtest, and look for cases where a puzzle or some exploration and resource gathering can be used to give the player a break from combat. There was such a need toward the end of the zoo level, and thankfully in this case we were able to make use of the toner prototype level that had already been built.
Mags left.
When we decided to resurrect our toner prototype level for use as a pacing break in the zoo, we had the opportunity to make some improvements and integrate elements that hadn't existed when we had first experimented with the toner mechanic. For example, the newly developed explosive Zen bloaters were added at various points along the puzzle to surprise players and remind them that they need to keep an eye out for these hazards. Also, in the intervening months, the toner mechanic itself had evolved from one where players merely push a ball of energy along a path to one which included branching paths and rotating junctions. This junction here in the breaker box is the linchpin of the whole puzzle, as the player must interact with it 3 times. Once to open the roller door to this back area, once to switch power away from the roller door to the last leg of the puzzle, and once to reopen the roller door in order to exit. Because this toner puzzle covers such a large physical area, including some zombie combat in the middle, players frequently lost track of the correspondence between the state of this junction and the roller door. This meant that they would trap themselves back here and not understand how to proceed. To address this, we made a lot of changes to the presentation of this junction over the course of development. The unique breaker box and tangle of conduit are designed to make the junction recognizable as the same junction from both sides of the wall. The shape of the hole in the wall and the orientation of the breaker box are designed to make sure that the player stands in the right location to have line of sight to the roller door and see that it closes when they route power away from it to the last leg of the puzzle. The door itself also makes a lot of noise and an unreasonable amount of sparks to draw attention to itself each time it moves. This particular puzzle twist was in danger of being cut for a long time, but with this series of refinements, enough playtesters understood its behavior that we were comfortable with shipping it in the final game.
locking down the area.
Good luck trying to lock out someone wielding an Alyx.
3 mags left.
The emergence from the zoo gave us an opportunity to present players with a dramatic vista and to show them how much progress they had made in the journey to the vault. This is challenging because the vault's position in the world was already determined to be above the parking garage, which the player would reach at the end of the map. But placing the vault correctly in support of that location left the vault looking too distant to create the dramatic view we wanted here. We also intended to portray the cutting of the vault's power cables by the Vortigunts at this point, but having this take place at such a distant location was unclear and confused playtesters. The solution was to move everything closer. The vault looked more imposing looming above the player, and the effects of the Vortigunts' cable cutting efforts were much clearer. All we needed then was a conceit to justify the 2 vault locations, the location here at the start of the map and the eventual location at the end of the map. Around this same phase of development, we were in the process of defining exactly how the player would bring down the vault, and our solution to that problem also helped justify the 2 vault locations. Tractor beams are a familiar cliché in science fiction and often share a common visual style of an enveloping force field emitted net-like from a single point. Using a tractor beam as a combined failsafe device to catch the vault served us well here. It allowed us to prevent Alyx from being crushed by the vault dropped out of the sky when the Vortigunts hit the final power cable, and it gave us a satisfactory mechanism for moving the vault to the location we need it to be at the end of the map. Throughout the map, the beam itself also serves as a beacon, ensuring that the players are always able to recognise their new goal, the tractor beam control station.
There's somebody up there.
It's not Combine. Maybe a scavenger? Be careful. Eli, come here!
What is it, Russell?
Listen to this.
Whoa. Shh.
Okay, let's go get them. You took over the entire planet in 7 hours. How is this taking so long? Oh, no, fine. I can wait. That was sarcasm. Well, I'm thrilled you caught that. Yes, that was sarcasm as well. And just to remind you the thing I need to talk to your boss.
The final twist of the game presented quite a few storytelling challenges for the writers. The game is long, much longer than a movie, and the surprise reveal of the G-Man at the end felt almost impossible to sustain over the entire experience. Everyone on the team assumed that through basic deduction, most players are going to figure it out along the way. So the solution, like in most good stories, was to just add more stuff, more details, more questions, and more nooks and crannies to the plot. The writers quickly realized that there was one big distracting name, Gordon Freeman, that would pull the players' attention away from any theories they may be cooking up on their own. We then realized that we could use the absence of the G-Man in the story, and the eerie parallels between the G-Man and Gordon's experiences at Black Mesa, to redirect player attention and propel the story towards the final act.
Eli,
If the player thought they had uncovered a new mission to save Gordon Freeman from stasis, then the twist at the end could be secure. To pull it off, the writers created a new, mysterious character, a scientist collaborating with the Combine. This addition came late in the project, so the writers relied on another tried-and-true tact. Base the character on an actor we're fond of, and then do our absolute best to cast and record with that person. The chosen actor had struck a particular tone with the writers. She has an easy, in-command confidence, and a smooth southern Missouri drawl. This not only sets her apart from the other characters in the Half-Life universe, but makes the character easy to hear on the page, which is incredibly important when time is short at the end of the project. And once she was in the studio, her pitch-perfect performance assured us that we'd made the correct decision. Of course, then the scene still had to be built. Level designers figured out what existing chunk of level track could be bumped out to fit the scene. The area we chose previously held some barnacles and a few light puzzle elements, which the designers weren't upset to lose. The level track had to be altered to funnel you into a place where the scene could unfold and the player could eavesdrop without getting a good look at the character. This served two purposes. One was that it would benefit the mystery for the scene to feel furtive and for the identity of the character to remain secret. But also, we could shroud the performance and the intricate facial animation necessary to bring a character to life, all in shadow, for the animators and the choreographers. Like in a lot of cases, not doing the work was the correct thing for both the story and our tight shipping schedule.
The purpose of this hideout was to give players a nice reward for being observant and exploring the environment. We wanted to highlight the story of scavengers living behind the quarantine wall, what their lives might look like, and why they might choose to live there. The person who lived here was referred to internally as the Combine Killer, imagined as a person with a grudge against the Combine who has chosen to eke out a living in the quarantine zone, spending their time exacting revenge on unsuspecting Combine patrols, perhaps eventually joining the organized resistance movement portrayed in Half-Life 2. The purpose of this hideout was to give players a nice reward for being observant and exploring the environment. We wanted to highlight the story of scavengers living behind the quarantine wall, what their lives might look like, and why they might choose to live there. The person who lived here was referred to internally as the Combine Killer, imagined as a person with a grudge against the Combine who has chosen to eke out a living in the quarantine zone, spending their time exacting revenge on unsuspecting Combine patrols, perhaps eventually joining the organized resistance movement portrayed in Half-Life 2.
once we get Gordon back, we can really get ambitious, don't you think, Russ? Maybe we could take down the Citadel.
Well, he saved humanity once. I'm willing to bet he can do it again.
And this time he won't have to do it alone.
Watch it. I don't want to get any of this crap on me. Why? Is it dangerous? We're not dumping it in the pit. Overwatch requested. What is
In recent years, video game streaming has become one of the main ways that players engage with the culture of games, and this is even more true for VR titles, where players who do not have VR equipment want to participate. To address this audience, we created a spectator HUD, which displays the VR player's health, ammunition, resin, and the contents of their wrist pockets. This information is overlaid on the 3D scene in the desktop window, and lets viewers track the state of the player's resources, without having to rely on the player to look at their wrist or open up a menu. The Spectator HUD started off as a tool used by the development team to display resources, as well as the state of controller buttons and other diagnostic information. An interesting side effect of this HUD was that it made playtests way more exciting to watch, because we as an audience had information the player wasn't necessarily aware of. For example, playtest observers might realize that a player had barely survived an encounter when the players themselves had never even checked their health. We even saw cases where players killed an enemy with their very last bullet without realizing it themselves. The highs and lows we felt watching our own playtests were something that we wanted to share with the streaming audience, and it's been exciting to see streamers using it in the wild.
Three mags left. Russ, what do you think they're doing to Gordon Freeman in there?
That's a good question.
Are they, sucking his brain out?
I think they're going to move him off-world.
Well, either way, let's not find out. I'll get there before it happens. Russ, what's the deal with the crowbar?
Oh, you mean Gordon Freeman's crowbar?
Yeah.
Oh, Alyx. He fought his way out of Black Mesa with nothing but that crowbar.
No way.
It's true. Well, it's true that that's what they say. You know, nobody knows for sure.
Well, when I get him out, let's give him a gun.
Yes, not mine. I'm out of the gun lending business. Okay? Combine do know how to upgrade a gun. I'll give them that.
4 shells left.
Creating a climactic battle that capped off the antlion combat proved to be a challenging design problem. We wanted to create a sustained combat experience that was substantial enough to challenge players who had refined their skills against the antlion. But simply throwing a large number of antlions at the player all at once was not a particularly engaging experience, nor was it compatible with our established combat balancing. Rather than containing the player in a restricted space and spawning waves of enemies, we wanted to keep the player engaged and moving through a gauntlet of constant pressure toward a goal. To do this, we needed an arena with a clear linear flow and a porous layout that would allow the player to maintain sight of their goal while being flanked by swarms of antlions as they moved toward it. This tanker yard, which we had originally built for a narrative scene that was cut from the game, had the properties we were looking for. The long tanker cars lead toward the intended direction of travel, and their positioning requires the player to pay careful attention to their sides and rear as they advance. The Combine Tractor Beam Tower is framed at the end of the tracks, providing a clear goal for the player. The placement of the glowing red sign in the direction of the tractor beam was also a deliberate decision, a technique used by the environment artist to subconsciously pull players in the desired direction via visual contrast, even in the event that they've momentarily lost their bearings in the chaos of the battle. The pacing of the combat here was carefully balanced to leave most playtesters on the brink of being overwhelmed and feeling like they made it through by just the skin of their teeth. It took many iterations of enemy placement, ammo and item placement, and player path adjustments to achieve this balance. We ultimately settled on a design that featured a steady stream of advancing antlions, with antlion spitters placed at the far end of the space, applying enough pressure to prevent players from rushing toward the goal. Combine soldiers up on the raised platforms divert player attention to the right-hand flank and provide verticality in target prioritization, adding to the sense of frenzy we sought to create.
The goal of this puzzle was to create a moment of heightened stress by requiring players to deal with a sudden threat after being placed in a precariously disadvantageous position. In the original design of the puzzle, players would stand on a platform which was suspended from a cable and pull themselves across the chasm. Halfway across, antlion spitters would emerge and start attacking. The platform provided limited cover, and players would have to make trade-offs between taking cover and continuing to propel themselves forward. This succeeded in creating the desired spike in intensity, but unfortunately, the lateral movement of the platform caused considerable motion sickness for most playtesters. Even players who were comfortable with the vertical movement of elevators elsewhere in the game were adversely affected here. The puzzle that we shipped retains the same sense of tension due to being stranded in the middle of a chasm under attack, but does not rely on physically moving the player. The upper portion of the wooden platform is deliberately devoid of any substantial cover, which encourages players to jump onto the platforms below. On the lower platforms, we provide enough cover to protect players from antlions, but also leave them feeling vulnerable out in the middle of the chasm. The cover here is porous and breakable, increasing the sense of urgency and requiring players to engage the antlions from their compromised position.
Alyx, we're getting close to the vault now. You're not going to have many more chances to use your resin.
Good point. I'll see if there are any upgrades I can use.
I can't believe my pistol's made it this far.
I was thinking about giving it to Gordon.
Oh wow, check it out. My gun just keeps getting better and better.
You know, Russ, technically, I don't think there's a whole lot of your gun left anymore.
I'll tell you what, let's put that idea on hold for now. We can chat about my gun when you get back.
shells left.
In cases where the player had to face off against Combine in relatively open spaces like this one, we often found that playtesters would backtrack to safety and attempt to pick away at the soldiers from a distance. The playtesters would ultimately be successful in clearing the combat space, but would feel unsatisfied with the encounter due to the repetitive and static nature of the tactics that they employed. To address this, we used a few design tools to discourage this type of player behavior. The placement of the Combine suppressor, standing on the bed of the truck at the far end of the courtyard here, is the key to the design flow of this battle. The suppressor does not move from his planted position on the far side of the courtyard while the player is on the near side. His positioning, combined with his unrelenting wall of suppressing fire, forces the player to advance in order to close the distance required to take him out, all while under the intense pressure from a carefully crafted combination of other Combine units. Additionally, if the player backtracks far enough from the fight, the more mobile Combine soldiers in the encounter are told to retreat and hold their ground until the player once again advances into the combat. These elements together keep players moving forward into locations that provide for more interesting opportunities for both the player and the enemy soldiers.
Those beams are coming from the top of this tower, right?
Yeah, that's right.
Three cells left. Last one.
In cases where the player had to face off against Combine in relatively open spaces like this one, we often found that playtesters would backtrack to safety and attempt to pick away at the soldiers from a distance. The playtesters would ultimately be successful in clearing the combat space, but would feel unsatisfied with the encounter due to the repetitive and static nature of the tactics that they employed. To address this, we used a few design tools to discourage this type of player behavior. The placement of the Combine suppressor, standing on the bed of the truck at the far end of the courtyard here, is the key to the design flow of this battle. The suppressor does not move from his planted position on the far side of the courtyard while the player is on the near side. His positioning, combined with his unrelenting wall of suppressing fire, forces the player to advance in order to close the distance required to take him out, all while under the intense pressure from a carefully crafted combination of other Combine units. Additionally, if the player backtracks far enough from the fight, the more mobile Combine soldiers in the encounter are told to retreat and hold their ground until the player once again advances into the combat. These elements together keep players moving forward into locations that provide for more interesting opportunities for both the player and the enemy soldiers.
Alyx, you there?
Yeah, Dad?
It looks like you will be able to get into the vault from up there. There's a terminal that extends a bridge to the entrance.
What's the security like inside?
I got it all laid out in front of me, and I tell you, there is security. But I've never seen anything like it. It doesn't make any sense.
I guess I'll have to improvise.
Don't worry, honey. I'll figure it out.
Alyx, dead ahead. Those controls dock the vault to the station.
On it.
At the start of the previous map, we introduced the tractor beam, a failsafe device used to catch the falling vault when the last substation was knocked offline.
You know, honey,
In this location, the console looks like it could be used to control the tractor beam to dock the vault for entry via the nearby gantry on the left. We decided to have the vault crash to the ground spectacularly, but for this to work emotionally, we needed the scene to increase in tension beforehand. The whole vault docking console is absurd by design. If the console appeared too much like a legitimate puzzle, playtesters could take too long and let the air out of the scene, unsure if there was something that they could actually solve. The more inscrutable the machine looked, the more likely they were to interact with the levers and play along with the unfolding disaster. The first phase of the puzzle extends the catwalk and unlocks the main lever bin, which responds to the player's input, engaging them in the solution. Every subsequent lever thrown does nothing except increase the tension as things continue to go wrong. The back-and-forth radio dialogue between Alyx and Russell completes the scene with growing panic and keeps players in the moment, flipping levers in an attempt to save the vault.